by STUE, and today we will be talking about, and I do have to be accurate here, our lecture topic today is financialization of housing and the role of the state. Can sustainability be achieved? Our lecturer is Özlem Celik from the University of Helsinki. She is a university lecturer at the University of Helsinki. With that, I turn it over to you, Özlem, please.
Thank you very much. So the first things first, I recently had a bike accident. That's why I might be mostly sitting. I'm thinking because I have a back pain, but I might stand up at some points as well. So that's why I normally don't like to sit when I'm talking, but yeah, the body forces me to sit a bit these days. But thank you very much for having me here in Tampere University. It's also my first time in Tampere, the city, and also in the university. I really love the campus and the colors of autumn. As Mikko mentioned, I'm working at University of Helsinki at Global Development Studies discipline as a lecturer. First I want to thank STUE and Postcape and Tampere University and Mikko, who facilitated all this planning of the talk and everything. But thank you for coming. So that's another thing. I hope you're going to enjoy the talk. I'm hoping that to talk for an hour, but I'm happy to get any questions anytime. So you can just stop me, and if you just put your hand up, then I can just please ask. Because if you need some clarifications, then I can respond to you when I'm talking. It's totally fine for me, but I'm going to also have some questions for you to the start. To introduce myself briefly, so why I am here, what am I doing in my research? I define myself as an urban studies scholar. I'm coming from urban political economy approach, and mainly a Marxist perspective I'm taking in my research, but I have a wider range of interests in urban political economy, including financialization of housing, housing movements, commoning practices, urban commoning practices, and how they relate to each other. But I'm specifically interested in role of the state in shaping urban development, specifically in Turkey, but also recently I got a grant with a colleague from Malmö University, from Formas, from Sweden, and we are now moving towards doing research on Sweden and on Nordic cities. And I'm very much interested in Tampere to do some research as well. We were talking with Mikko about that, but we will come to that towards the end of the talk. But now the direction of my research is going through more towards sustainability and how the climate adaptation strategies of cities affecting the urban political economy as a whole, theoretically, but also in practice. So that's what it is. So in this talk, I will start first positioning housing in critical political economy from a historical perspective, because I thought maybe some of you are not very much familiar of the topic of housing itself, but also how it has started in critical political economy. And then we're going to talk about what is financialization. I also thought that maybe you're not familiar about the concept, but mainly we're going to focus on financialization of housing and role of the state in housing financialization. And the last part of the talk is going to be, can sustainability be achieved under these economic conditions? And then we are going to focus on climate urbanism and gentrification mostly. Then I'm going to give some hints about what can be the future research for people like you who are very young and doing research. So what can you do and us do for future research to understand this change? And there will be Q&A at the end as well. To understand critical political economy, I decided to start from before the 1970s. So in 19th century, as you know, when the Industrial Revolution started, there has been a debate about political economy, and of course Marxian approach started in that period of time. At that time, housing wasn't a part of political economy. It was more like a part of a social policy. But the only almost, or the main research done on housing those days was by Engels and the book called Housing Question, which was inspired by the German Industrial Revolution, where the workers didn't have enough housing and they demanded housing at the time, and he experienced the same things in Manchester where he was living. So the book is about how the discussions happened in Germany is happening in elsewhere in Manchester, where the working class housing wasn't enough. And the main contribution of Engels' book was for us to think about the relationship, a new relationship between the land tenure, the tenure, who is the wage laborer, so the tenant, who is living in the houses, or the workers, and who is the landowner, or the flat owner. So this has started as a new relationship which hasn't happened before. So his focus was, we need to understand this new relationship between capital and labor, and housing is the main issue in this discussion. So since 1970s, housing hasn't been much discussed a part of political economy. But 1970s also was the starting point of the main discussions around urban political economy, where working class movement was quite strong, and especially in Paris, when the student movement was making demands, they were also making demands for right to the city, right to the urban, right to housing. So those days was also a starting point of housing included in urban political economy. But the main discussions of 1970s was again shaped by Marxist understanding of land rent theory. So the main discussions were looking at how the extraction of rent is created through housing in the big cities. So so around rent theory, the role of class and housing was started to be discussed. So when you look at the literature around those days, you see, can we define working class as a new housing class? Or do we need to discuss housing as a part of different class relations? So that was the main topics which were discussed in the 1970s. There were some discussions about role of the state, but it was more from an institutionalist perspective, where the state needs to provide housing for everyone. So it was more like the welfare role of the state from a more Keynesian or institutionalist perspective. When we come to 1980s, so it was like a very quick shift to neoliberalization, and neoliberalization had a specific impact on housing, as probably you all know, and it is the time where cities became the center for investment. And of course, it was a continuation of the discussions of rent theory, class, role of the state, but this time, under the impact of neoliberalization, the cities started to compete with each other to attract investment, which affected the working class mostly, and they affected affordable housing. So the main question of 1980s was how we can access affordable housing. And also it created inequalities. But what has changed, and which we are going to talk about today mostly, is the 2007 global economic crisis, from neoliberalization to 2007 crisis, where the financialization as a new form of capital accumulation started. And we will discuss whether this started by the crisis or before the crisis and how it started. But financialization directly had an impact on housing because the capital which was invested in production sector needed a new arena to invest, because the production sector wasn't producing enough capital. So capital needs refuge to another sphere of production, which is the built environment, and specifically housing. So financialization created new tools, new mechanisms, new actors, to support the capital to move towards that area. And what has happened after the crisis is what we see, because there were lots of bankruptcies, even some banks got into bankruptcies, and people got into bankruptcies. They couldn't pay their mortgages. Then what happened is the state started to play a leading role to regulate, but also still to facilitate financialization in that process for housing specifically, which we will come back. So the last crisis, which we're going to talk about, is the climate crisis. So how the climate crisis, which is, a big discussion nowadays about everything, how climate crisis is related to different spheres of life, but climate crisis has a specific impact on housing, and also it is not free from financialization. So today we're going to see how climate crisis, financialization, and housing work together. But the main discussions we are going to go through will be how two crises happening recently in the world is shaping our daily lives. So before I start, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions also to understand where you are in what I'm going to talk about. So feel free to answer, and if you don't want to, that's okay too. But the first thing I want to, you can also just show your hands. Have you heard about financialization before this course? Did you know anything about financialization? You heard about it, but have you? Okay, good. But have you heard about anything about financialization of housing in critical urban political economy? Okay, the numbers are getting lower and lower. And so I'm thinking you haven't thought about much about what can be the actors of financialization of housing. Maybe some of you did. So do you think, of course this is after the readings as well, do you think financialization of housing variegates? Yes? Yeah? Or it is a one process that affects everyone in the same way? For the first one, the yes ones, you can show your hands. Yes, variegates. And no, it doesn't variegate. It doesn't variegate, okay. And have you also thought about whether climate crisis was something in relation to housing and financialization? Or it is the first time we're going to talk about it? More or less first time, how nice, great. So, what is financialization? Financialization has been discussed quite a lot in the literature since 1990s actually, but there are some who are claiming that it has been a research topic since 1970s, and most of them are economists and heterodox economists who claim that we already started talking about it. But what is said by Baylis, Fine, and Robertson was that it is an empirically rich but conceptually chaotic collective posture, which means that there are loads of empirics about financialization. So numbers, graphics, reports, but we don't really know what financialization is for us. So the discussion turned its focus into so is it a new chapter of neoliberalism? Is it a new chapter of capitalism? Or is it a totally new process we are facing to? And this is still an ongoing discussion, so I'm not going to give you an answer for that. But the main argument, which I also agree as a scholar of financialization, it is a buzzword, which means there is an absence of a real definition, but we kind of know what it brings to us, because I think you all have more or less a credit card, so we're all in the financialized process. At least we all have a banking account, which more or less related to financialization nowadays, especially in Finland. or some of you are mortgage payers. So we are aware that it is affecting our daily life, but we really don't know what it is. So Sawyer made a very extensive definition of financialization. And so he says 5 dynamics behind financialization. The first thing is it is the expansion and the proliferation of financial instruments and services in our daily lives. So which brought a whole new set of tools and institutions and new markets to us. And secondly, he claimed, which we are also going to talk about today, is that financialization creates future markets for trading in commodities, yet not to be produced. For example, future carbon trading. I'm sure you heard of carbon trading. So it is something not yet to be produced, but it is a future market. And also subprime mortgages, which is not produced, but it will come eventually. So that's the nature of financialization, which is quite different from neoliberalism in that sense. And thirdly, he's seen a strong association with market mechanisms and financialization, which is quite similar to neoliberalism in that sense, because financialization works as a complementary or bringing a new set of arrangements for the market to work even more and better and actively. Which it also brings rising inequalities or new inequalities to the different spheres of life. And fourthly, Sawyer also claims that consumption has often been shaped by financialization as well, which is the extension of credit in our lives. And lastly, he claims, and which we're going to talk about, is that financialization penetrates to the reproduction spheres of our lives, including housing, health, pensions, and so on. So what is the definition of financialization of housing then? Financialization of housing is discussed by two sides in the literature. One side of the analysis were examining the supply side, and the other side was looking at the demand side of financialization of housing. The supply side analysis focuses on the new financial agents and tools, which expands investment in housing by finance capital, and including new real estate financial systems, real estate investment trusts, new mortgage loans and securitizations. And secondly, the growth strategies of real estate developers started to be a part of the economic development in everywhere. Thirdly, there has been a series of new national and international programs for affordable housing, which are also financialized. So they are different from what we used to see in affordable housing. The fourth one is I'm sure you mostly know about post-disaster redevelopment programs, which are included in the supply side of financialization analysis. And lastly, the international slum upgrading programs in the global south, which were mostly financed by Bretton Woods institutions, are also a part of the new era of financialization. And these all create a new form of financial inclusion for all. So what is the idea of the market and also the state is to include all of us into the financial system. But when we look at the demand side analysis of financialization of housing, we explore new forms of promotion for home ownership. So even if someone who cannot afford to buy housing are now forced in a way, because there is no other alternative for living in an affordable housing unit. And so new mortgage mechanisms are created for different groups. So even who cannot afford housing included in the sections. And this is one of the things, of course, behind the global financial crisis, especially extensively in Northern America. We know that the racial communities are kind of forced to buy houses and they couldn't pay it back after the crisis, which created the housing bubble afterwards. The second thing of the demand-side analysis is the role of home ownership culture in the process of financialization. I'm sure you all know about the TV shows about how to renew your housing, how to buy a new house, because mostly financialization of housing literature do not much discuss about this renewing part. But we know that there is a huge extension of credit goes into the renewal of housing or renovation of housing. And lastly, what Rolnik and Soderberg calls this process is the marketization of housing rights of the poor through new financial mechanisms. This means that the meaning of home is shifted from its use value to its exchange value. So when you're choosing a place to live, you're not anymore, of course, to a certain extent, you're thinking of whom I'm going to be neighbor with or which school I'm going to send my kids. But now you're more thinking of if I will put it in the market, how much would I get in return? So the exchange value of housing became the new norm through the financialization process. So financialization of housing can be defined as the expansion of financial tools, mechanisms, actors, and institutions in housing provision, where the capital has sought refuge to build environment from production sector, which is called capital switching. So in the field of financialization of housing, one of the main concepts is capital switching. Mostly, it is referred to Harvey's seminal work on how the capital moves from one sphere to another, where there's a crisis in capitalism. So capital switching is discussed as capital was in the first sphere, in the production sphere, but the accumulation of capital was there was overaccumulation in the first sphere. So that overaccumulation need to be put in another sphere, which is the second sphere of capital, is the urban development. So according to Harvey, capital switching is happening in those moments of crisis. So what we're going to see in this talk is capital switching has happened in the crisis of 2007, and capital switching has happened and still happening in climate crisis. In Alvarez and Fernanda's work, what we've seen new in financialization of housing is that they claimed it doesn't happen the same way everywhere. Financialization of housing variegates in different countries. Even if financialization is a global process, it has impacts. It has different impacts in different localities, which is coming from the historical structures in a particular place. So how can we define variegated financialization of housing? It is a dynamic process, but it interacts to the specific historical and institutional trajectories of national capital accumulation processes and the structural real sector configurations in a particular country. And this whole definition of variegated financialization of housing comes from the definition of variegated residential capitalism, which claims the role of the welfare state and housing finance historically changes the residential capitalism. So Fernandez and Albers claims that housing systems across the world variegates unevenly, so the financialization of housing is going to variegate unevenly across the world. So Fuller, in his book, brought a kind of a categorization to put different housing systems in Europe and Northern America and try to understand how financialization of housing variegates. And his key argument is that we need to examine housing systems in particular countries to understand the variegation, and he did it by using four categories. One was the use of mortgage financing, so how much mortgage finance is used in those countries. Second, is there social housing? And is it like how much social housing is a part of the housing provision in that country? Third, how much people are renting and how much of the population is the homeowners? And fourthly, he said we need to look at the ability to use housing as a substitute for saving. So in some countries, housing is also a part of a saving process, but in some countries, it is not, like in Germany. Normally, I'm giving the categorizations of him, but because of the time, I didn't go into that. But what we've seen in the literature was that the financialization of housing, mostly the literature focused on Europe and North America. So there wasn't much research done out of Europe and North America. But recently, a group of researchers, including me, started to do research on, you might call it Global South, or the places beyond Europe and North America. Because we saw that there are differences in different countries, and it is not possible to understand what is claimed by Fuller or Albers or Fernandez, how the variegation happens in different countries, but we need different mechanisms, and which we claim that it is shared by Europe or in North America as well, but you're not focusing on them. So the main differences happening in the Global South was a limited attempt or non-existence of welfare state. And the second is there is an effective neoliberal restructuring programs under Bretton Woods institutions, like in most countries in South Africa. The housing programs are funded by Bretton Woods institutions, like slum upgrading programs. And in Turkey, the housing financialization is dictated basically by IMF. But the third one is in the Global South, there is a massive existence of informal or illegal, so it really depends where you are, but a massive existence of illegal housing, which also was, for the first time, the target of housing provision. But this time, it wasn't for people to renovate the houses and stay there, but the main idea of these programs was displacement of people who are living in those areas to the peripheries of the cities and using the land freed from the working class for like luxury housing investments or other things for to get the revenue out of that. So that's quite different when we look at the European examples. Fourthly, there's an absence of urban and housing policies, which might sound weird, that how can we know there are no policies about housing, but mostly it was just left to the market to decide, or it was left to the people to do their own houses. So the housing provision wasn't defined as a task of the state to provide for everyone. So this is very similar to the absence of welfare state, and which creates now ambivalent tenure structures when you want to go through the process of renovation, for example. The state mostly uses it as a strategy where they can pay very minimum amount of money for people who used to live there and buy the land from them, because it's not possible to show some papers, basically, for the ownership. The fourth one, which is different, is the urban regeneration or slum upgrading projects, which are also related to the Bretton Woods institutions programs. And the next one is the whole financialization of housing brought even more precarious forms of living conditions, especially for the poor in those countries, which were left being indebted, forced eviction, displacement, and homelessness. So now we're going to move on, and also the main difference between the global south and global north, in a way, is the role of the state, because what we've seen in the global south, because of the absence of institutions, regulations, housing provision strategies, the state now had to take a role to shape the whole mechanism of housing provision, but this time not for the people, but for financialization. So we've seen mostly a centralized, even authoritarian, but very active role of the state in housing provision through financialization. Is there any questions? It is, yeah. I will touch upon that, yeah. But what I will come as the third role of the state, which is something actually we can define from the global south, but I think it is applicable to anywhere. So yeah, we will come to that. So we will look at the literature of roles of the state in housing financialization. And I categorized these roles in three, and we'll go look at them separately. The first one is facilitator. The role of the state is being the facilitator of financialization. And the second role is state is the market maker of financialization. And thirdly, it is the deliberate developer, as if it is a market actor. So when we say the state is the facilitator of financialization, what do we mean? The role of the state as a facilitator comes with towards a more understanding of state as from an institutional perspective, where the state institutions provide new legislation to facilitate financialization, or start new regulatory regimes, new financial instruments, and this enables the financial capital to penetrate into the housing sector. So if you look at some examples from the literature, this can include saving the banks, so the bad banks which got bankrupted in 2007 crisis. So, for example, in Ireland, we saw that the state saved bad banks, or in the UK, or they paid it's called toxic loans, which means that people who couldn't pay for them, so they're back to the market as debt. So the state paid for the toxic loans to save the market in a way. So this was like the state facilitates the market to grow. But also, this also happens in the promotion of indebtedness. So the state facilitates the promotion of indebtedness or taking loans in different models, like getting mortgages or providing new bonds, like green bonds, social bonds, which are also happening in Finland. I'm not going to talk about it much, but also here, green bonds and social bonds entered to the urban development market recently, and has been happening in Sweden for a longer time. The other part of the facilitation role is changing the regulation for real estate investment trusts, which can become more active agents in housing financialization. Real estate investment trust dates back to 1980s, so from the start of neoliberalization, but we see that in the beginning of 2000s and after the crisis, the regulations for real estate investment trusts, or the capacity for them to maneuver in the market, has expanded by new regulations made by the state. So they can be more active in housing financialization process. And the last example we can see is that the state also facilitates the process of cleansing the working class neighborhoods by creating new laws, like in the UK, squatting became illegal, and in Turkey it turned into a criminal act if you squat somewhere. So these are only some examples. Secondly, state as the market maker in housing financialization. So in this one, different from being a facilitator, state itself creates the market. So state itself becomes the market maker by reshaping regulations and intervening in markets in order to create conditions, not only facilitating, but creating conditions for financialization to occur, and also to encourage investors and developers to come to their city to invest for example, big infrastructure investments like Tampere tram. And lastly, the state started to use the tools which already was in its hands to create the market for new investments by changing land use regulations, by changing urban planning decisions, and giving new taxation regimes, or creating new taxation regimes, and also enclosure of land and expropriation of public land. So we see different examples in Europe and North America, and also in emerging economies like Turkey. In Europe and North America, it is the form of, especially the expropriation and enclosure of land, was state-led privatization of public lands. What happens in Europe and North America, which is not happening in the emerging economies much, because the economies are not very stable for global corporate landlords to enter, but what we see in the north is global corporate landlords come to a city and buys millions of houses, literally, and runs them. And this is happening extensively in Germany, especially in central cities, where you can have Airbnbs, for example. So this is mostly happening in the rental housing market, where global corporate landlords elsewhere come and buy the land or the rental housing, and the state, for example, in the case of Berlin, the local state is creating new regulations where the global corporate landlords can enter the market, which they weren't able to before. And this, of course, follows up with reno-evictions, which means that evictions coming from renovations, so people who cannot afford renovations in their houses are evicted, or demo-evictions, which is like people's houses who are demolished and going to be rebuilt again, but who can't afford them are evicted. So these are the cases happening in North America. Definitely. But if I'm not wrong, what happened in Poland, quite similar to Turkey in that sense, it was a response to 2001 crisis, not 2007. So it started in 1990s, but accelerated in 2001 crisis. So the state started to be more active in opening the market to the investors. So
yeah. Investors started buying like millions of houses. Like one investor could have 500 flats, for example.
yeah, I remember I was in Warsaw for a meeting, and I had a walk around the city, and this was in 2000, just after the crisis actually. So like in 2009 or something. So it could not happen that quickly. But I remember I saw loads of posters in the city where they're like new houses are going to be built, these are going to be demolished. So yeah, the process in Poland started early on. What happened after 2007 crisis, the acceptance, I think, of the integration of financial tools and actors are supported globally. That's the, I think, main change, what happened. Yeah, but thank you, yes. Yeah, in the emerging economies, the market-making role is a little bit different from the North America, and which brings accumulation by dispossession, which comes from state-led gentrification processes. So state is taking the role of the market in that sense, but also helping the market, like doing the first phase of gentrification to make the market for other investors to come, or bringing the infrastructure in a certain area, and then the investors and developers are interested in coming to that particular place. Also in the emerging economies, there is one thing which is a bit different from the northern cases, is that the market making was not only for the global actors of the market, but for the domestic actors in the market. So the domestic capital started to put lots of pressure on the state to be included in the process. Because what was happening in the emerging economies, there hasn't been a strong capital accumulation in construction sector as it was happening in Northern Europe or Northern America, because most of the construction was done through more informal ways, and it was more like a piecemeal fashion of doing housing and production of housing. But to involve those small capital or middle-sized capital owners in the local markets was also supported by the state. So what we see, for example, in Turkey, there are different regulations if you are an investor from Turkey, and there are different regulations if you're coming out of Turkey. So it can change in that sense. Is everything okay? Good with time, I think. And the last one is the deliberate developer role of the state, which doesn't. So maybe I need to explain this before. This doesn't mean that the state in any country has one role. Mostly, they have overlapping roles. So in some instances, we see most of the state as a facilitator, market maker, and deliberate developer. Or in some cases, we see the state as a facilitator and market maker, but not as a deliberate developer. So this might change or variegate in a sense, so the role of the state can change. In the last role, which is defining the role of the state as being actively and directly threatening land as a financial asset. So the state is not doing it only by its regulations, like in facilitator or market maker role, the state doing it itself. So the state treats the public land they own as a financial asset and uses it in the market as for the exchange value of it. And secondly, it initiates financialization to develop fiscal and political capacity, which means the state itself takes the power, and to keep the power, that's why it becomes, like in the authoritarian cases, more obvious, to extend its political capacity to run the country. And thirdly, local and national state act as a speculative real estate developer, like as if any other developer. So what is interesting in that sense is the role of the state as a speculator, where mostly in the cases of Europe and emerging economies is that demolishing social housing and using that land not for social housing anymore, but creating state-led gentrification in those areas. So speculating the value of land in those areas. And this role also supported in the form of state-owned real estate investment trusts. So originally, real estate investment trusts are market tools and mechanisms. Normally, the state shouldn't have any role in it. But we see, like in the case of Turkey, in France, the biggest real estate investment trust of the country is the state. And they are leading the market because they hold the state land in their hand. So they are the big landowners of the country. So they're not anymore facilitating or market makers. They are a naive developer in the process, as if any other developer. But what is also deliberately done by the state is to diminish the other forms of housing provision. Because we know from the tasks of the welfare state is that there should be enough social housing for everyone. There should be enough, in case of rental housing, for affordable housing markets. But what we see in the deliberate developer role of the state is to diminish, or in some cases, totally erase the alternative forms of housing and leaving the housing provision only to private home ownership. So in the cases of, for example, in the UK, it is defined as it is the local state which is taking this role, not the national state. So this can also differ in different countries. And Beswick and Penny defined it as financialized municipal entrepreneurialism, like property developer. So according to them, financialization of public housing started to be a speculative one of the local authorities, because they needed to have basically money or capital to renew the housing areas, but they didn't have enough capacity for that. So they had to compete with other cities to get investment or to attract investment into their neighborhoods or cities. So they create this, they define it as financialized municipal entrepreneurialism, which is a new form of urban entrepreneurialism as well. And in the case of Turkey, nation state plays the role of the deliberate developer, where a central housing agency is created under the prime ministry, which runs all the planning decisions from neighborhood to city level or region level under one institution, under the authority of the prime minister at the time, now under the authority of the president of the country. And the state-owned real estate investment trust is the biggest landowner, which can make the decisions and which is the main speculator in the country. This, of course, brings, in every case, it brings the disciplining of housing movements, because, as you can imagine, when this is happening in almost everywhere, from big scale to small, there are housing movements against the process, because people are facing to be evicted from where they used to live, or they're forced to pay loans which they can't afford. So, of course, there are movements in many countries. But the state, as the deliberate developer, also violates the role of the state, which should bring prosperity and equality to everyone. And the deliberate developer of the state paves the way for disciplining the working class by using it as police force, or by using new regulations like criminalizing squatting, or putting people in custody or in prison if they protest. I don't think it is something very unfamiliar to any of us in these days, I think. And lastly, another example is China, where there is an authoritarian and central state is running the housing policy, but highly in a financialized fashion. And the tool they are using is assetization of land. So the housing program, in the central housing program of China, quite similar to Turkey, promotes home ownership and to boost the domestic consumption. So in China itself. Questions? It is not that far-fetched yet in Finland. Of course, I'm not an expert on Finland, but I'm trying to follow. But I think one thing which is changing in Helsinki, I don't know whether it changed yet, but this was a discussion from last summer, that the cities own a lot of land in Finland, and this new type of regulation for the public, the local state-owned lands, was the rent of the land was controlled by the municipalities so far. But with this new local governing, they suggested to leave it to the market, the level of rent to the market, and then using taxation for the redistribution of the rent, of the accumulation of capital from land. So this is going to, I think, bring a big change in Finland, because probably what is happening in Helsinki is going to be happening in anywhere else. But Finland is a strange case in Nordics, because home ownership has always been almost the major housing provision model in Finland, not in other Nordic cases. Yes, a follow-up? No. Yeah. There's one here, then yeah. There isn't much research on financialization of housing in Finland. The last speaker of this talk series, Mika, they did research on financialization of municipalities. So I think he's going to a little bit talk about that in his talk, because that's mainly this is what is happening in the Nordic countries. The financialization is occurring in the local state. Rather than in a specific sector. But then you see how it works in different sectors of life. but mostly it is the local state which gets financialized. And it is coming, of course, from the role of the welfare state because it holds the power. Yeah. No, it's very complementary, yeah, to what I'm saying. It's very complementary. It's also, I think, very evident where you have the land ownership of the state, then it is mostly going through land rent rather than directly housing itself, but it's the land rent. Yeah, we're coming to the end, so we'll go a little bit to sustainability. How are we doing with time, Mikko? Are we good?
We're good.
Very good, yeah. Okay, I will, yeah, see, I can't sit, even if I want to. So, in this scenario of the crisis, what happened with the climate crisis? How it is affecting how it is related to financial crisis and housing provision? Because, as you all know, sustainability has become one of the very popular yet very fuzzy words of the daily life, or also for research. But what critical urban political economy is very recently, like a couple of years for now, is trying to understand whether it is really possible to achieve sustainability in this financialized economy. So how the climate crisis is going to move on. Because we know that climate crisis is used by the city leaders, policymakers, to call for climate action in the cities, which is of course needed. I don't think anyone is opposing that. But one thing is needed is there is a fiscal challenge, because it means that there will be a huge investment on infrastructure, and there will be a huge change in infrastructure, which is going to bring climate fiscal challenge. But it is also a strategic economic opportunity, like we will see whether it is the case for Tampere tram, for example. But it can be. So it is kind of two sides of the blade in a way, because, I mean, time will show us probably that. But so far, research shows us that sustainability is not going to be achieved as it is promised. And climate change adaptation strategies of cities plays a big role, actually, in this non-achievement strategy. Because what climate adaptation strategies of cities requires is a large amount of public and private capital to adapt itself to climate change. And this means that investment in built environment, urban technologies, and infrastructure. I'm not going to go into that, but there is a huge literature looking at how digitalization affects cities for climate adaptation strategies. And it is mostly seen and exercised as a strategic economic opportunity. So what we've seen recently is that finance want to switch, so the capital wants to switch to another sphere, which is the green urbanization. So it is not only built environment, but it is green built environment is a new capital switching. And what we see is there are, from the Coalition for Urban Transition, and also, so it is both the policymakers, NGOs, local states, municipalities, but also researchers said that there is a government and public and administrative engagement and need tools for taking capital into green urban development. So some of the tools, which I'm not going to talk today as well, but this is going to be our new research, is green municipal bonds. So how green municipal bonds are used as the new financial tools for climate adaptation. So here, from climate crisis to ecological fix, the literature on critical urban political economy talks about fixes. So what does it mean? It's also coming from Harvey's conceptualization of fix. So Harvey claims that when there is a crisis in capital accumulation, it always looks for a fix, which means it's going to help the crisis to get out of crisis for a certain amount of time. This can take different forms. So what we see in the climate crisis is new forms of ecological fix. So short-term solutions to get out of the crisis. And what Castry and Christophorus, which was one of the articles, defining the ecological fix is it is used for future infrastructure investments to overcome, but they are temporary solutions. And the sources of funds for ecological fix is either nation state or private sector, private or public finance, or the nature of funds can be cash or credit, but it's still going to be either borrowing or using the pension funds or different forms of funds like green municipal bonds or social green social bonds. And the form of investment of funds can be invested as debt, so they're going to be repaid through interest rates, or in equity, which means that the payments are tied to the market value, so highly financialized. So according to them, ecological fix, the concept of ecological fix can help us to understand what is happening now. And a discussion following it was done by Long and Rice, because there has been, for the urbanists, probably this is something they already know, but there has been a huge literature on how we're going to create a sustainable urbanism. But now they claim, with the climate crisis, sustainable urbanism is shifted towards climate urbanism. And some claim that it is a new paradigm. It is different from sustainable urbanism because it brings a new set of values into state regulation, where it promotes cities as most viable sites of climate action, and also it protects city systems, so cities still compete with each other. The second and the main, as you see again, Tampere here, carbon neutral Tampere for 2030, and also of course in the other cities, is that carbon emission reduction, carbon monitoring, carbon management became the main tool of the climate urbanism, which is very different from sustainable urbanism. What does that mean when we talk about carbon emissions? It basically prioritizes physical and digital infrastructures, so cities compete with each other, being the eco-pioneers, of course, it brings urban competitiveness to get funding, to be carbon-free. But this also brings a disciplinary action at the institutional, neighbor, and individual level. Because we know, even like 10 years ago, I remember in a workshop for a EU funding writing, application writing, they gave us a task and they said, how are you going to create an app for the citizens to calculate their carbon emission? And now it is happening everywhere. Yeah. I totally agree. I totally agree, because I think it is also, there are some research, people are starting to look at it, but it is also giving the burden of climate crisis to individuals. So we are taking the burden of it as individuals and like putting, today I got this points, and you know, also it gives you other things that you can provide as a service. So if you kind of got the highest score of the neighborhood, you get scores in some cities, yeah. I think it is putting, so the last point of Long and Rice is, it is re-articulation of social justice, basically, which brings a scope and scale towards a broader moral imperative of survival, legitimizing surveillance, securitization, and depoliticization of environmental action. Because when you use the digital tools, you are being followed by the state, basically. So you are involved in the surveillance mechanisms, which maybe you're escaping from the cameras around the cities, but you're just using this phone to be a part of the surveillance mechanisms of city governing. And also it is bringing depoliticization to environmental action, because then you don't need to go onto the streets to demand any rights, because you can do it from your app. So why not? This is a quite new field of study. That's why it's quite still limited. But yeah, so I agree. So following that, there is a following discussion in relation to that. Then are we talking about a new wave of gentrification in the cities? Because since 2007, with the global financial crisis, we know that state-led eviction and gentrification expanded. So it has been happening, but it expanded. And as Albers called it, it's the fifth wave gentrification. So he says it is a state-sponsored gentrification, and it's a state-led global it's under the global corporate landlords, and in relation to platform capitalism. So maybe just not one new wave, but different waves of gentrification is coming, and after the climate crisis, and also after the global financial crisis. So this process is also called as financialized gentrification. So there are different definitions of gentrification in that sense. And in financialized gentrification, Crosby and Rizager, which are quite recent research on the demolitions, so how people are forced to be evicted because of the demolition in their housing units, where they can't afford anymore to pay the loans. So it is called financialized gentrification. But climate gentrification, on top of that, is a new research area and a new governing strategy under climate adaptation strategies. So we know that there are some examples happened in Gdansk, for example, with the state-led green regeneration, and in Philadelphia, where they used greening and resilience measures to start green gentrification and climate gentrification. Sustainability measures in Barcelona is also taking a new form of climate gentrification, and green municipal bonds used for redevelopment in Gothenburg in Sweden is ended up green gentrification and climate gentrification, and the paper you read, Climate Risk Management Practices, also brought green gentrification or climate gentrification. So what does it mean when it is a climate gentrification, how it differs from the other forms of gentrification? First, the state is one of the leading actors, so it is state-led in most cases. The state starts the gentrification. So it is kind of like a combination of the new form of state-led gentrification after climate crisis. And the other important part of climate gentrification is the use of new financial tools as a part of gentrification process, like green municipal bonds, which means in most of these cases, the target is to start more sustainable housing. Of course, it's great to have more sustainable housing for all, but what it means when you have more sustainable housing, it means there will be more costs coming with it, because it is very expensive to build sustainable housing. And and what it creates, because mostly they're small cases, they're not like huge investments. But what is happening, for example, in the use of green municipal bonds in Gothenburg, after the redevelopment of the houses into sustainable housing, the people who used to live there couldn't afford to pay the management fee, so they all had to leave. So that was the result of it. It is, yeah. Very true. And also, I think it is a kind of a deliberate strategy as well to separate them from each other. Then when you create specific financial tools for green sustainability, then you kind of lever it down for one type of sustainability. So it is not a broad understanding of sustainability. It is something new in Finland, so green municipal bonds started to be used in Finland, but they are used with social bonds. So they're not separate from each other. So the idea of climate-run investments by finance should be supported by both green features environmentally, but also for social sustainability. We will see what's going to happen at the end, but at least Finland is trying kind of a new model. So, yeah. Yeah, it is. It really depends. In different cases, you see different models. Because, for example, in Mumbai, when they started to the state-led gentrification in the very center of Mumbai, the first thing they did is they built a new train to the peripheries of the city, which is like an hour commute. And they built new housing areas there. And people who used to live in the slum areas of Mumbai, they were evicted to 1 hour distance neighborhoods. Exactly. So it is just like moving the problematic.
Yeah, it's very smart.
Yeah. Yeah, I should read that too. Yeah. So it is. It really depends. Sometimes they don't offer anything, but sometimes But this has been changed a bit after financialization, because what they wanted to do is not only displace people, but also still keep them in the mortgage scheme. Then you can offer affordable housing elsewhere. Then they can become mortgage payers, and disciplining them because they have to pay it, so they have to work. So you are in the loop, basically. So that's how it worked with financialization. Okay, so what can be the new research and future research? Of course, there are lots of different takes of what we can do, and I think we already discussed some of the future research directions. Normally, I like to make conclusions for academic research and also political action, but I think for today's talk, I couldn't separate them from each other. So I thought maybe academic research and political action is needed at the same time in this type of research. And so this is, of course, there is a specific method called activist research, who are the researchers like me and other people in the field who are involved in the movements, who are becoming an active member of the activism happening, but also producing research material out of that. So the feature of the research goes to how housing movements and against financialization of housing is a new field which is going to bring more research, and there will be 5 of the articles are published already, but there will be a new special issue coming in Housing Studies Journal in 2024, first issue, which I edited, on evictions and what are the how the housing movements impacted financialization of housing in different parts of the world, including student movements, for example, in Dublin, where they're forced to get loans for student housing because they can't afford it anymore after the financial crisis. And it has been a quite successful movement to get their rights. So I think one direction is we're going to see maybe more movements against the process, and climate crisis will bring more movements and hopefully more which are targeting to cities. But another research field which is growing is financialized climate gentrification. There has been some research done on financialization of rental housing markets in relation to gentrification, the role of global corporate landlords, and capital switching, the role of the state, and new financial tools. But this has been a very new field, and there is a network, if I'm not wrong, called as Climate Finance Network, and they are gathering researchers working on climate finance in cities specifically. And I think the sustainable fix to ecological fix is going to be one of the new fields, which we're going to see many more examples to understand what is going to happen in the future. But yeah, so thank you and kiitos for being here today. But of course, please ask more questions if you have here or during the